real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everyone, back with you again. It's Nathan Romas here, and we've got a repeat guest this time from episode 1. We've got Ryan Ferry, Sergeant of the Gang Suppression Team, back with us. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
We kind of left off last time. We're kind of getting into talking about the history of gangs and how some of this stuff, where we are today, started. So let's go back, because you're probably the most knowledgeable person I've ever heard speak on this stuff in Edmonton. So if you kind of want to give us a little rundown, tell us where this all kind of came from.
Yeah, sure. I think when we start talking about classification of gangs or criminal groups, it helps to have a base knowledge and a common understanding and a working definition. So depending on which source you go to, that's going to change how you define a gang. And so there's two leading sort of gang definitions that I think we can operate under. So the Criminal Code of Canada, after a number of revisions, addressed organized crime specifically. And the main bullet points on the org crime section within the Criminal Code is a criminal organization. It consists of 3 or more people that come together as one of their main activities, the commission of serious crimes. And it doesn't count for people that just come together in the moment, on the spur of the moment, to commit a serious crime, and then they disperse or disband. So there's that continuity piece that needs to be sort of accounted for. They don't have a minimum base requirement for, is that a month? Is that a week? Is that a couple of days? It's all contingent on the context. And the serious crimes are like the major crimes in the criminal code that are prescribed as indictable offenses with serious penalties attached to it. So it's importation of firearms, contraband substances, running a bawdy house, gaming houses, stuff like that, murder, serious violence offenses, stuff like that. So then the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada has a directive in terms of what are considered gangs and what are considered street gangs, and then each province is allowed to have their own definition as well. So it gets a little bit messy.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the majority of the provinces and the police agencies working within those provinces are somewhere around that same definition. And historically, when we look at across the Western world, at least, the definitions and the variability in those definitions can have some serious impacts on the population that ends up ultimately being targeted, and the implementation of whatever sort of interventions that the state brings to bear. So if historically we look at the UK, there were some researchers that put in some really good work. This is 20 years ago now. They weren't strict enough in their definition, as far as I understand. And they talked about a group of people that come together to commit crimes, and they have at their core fear, intimidation, or violence, or stuff like that. And what you can see, if you don't define the crime type, that can start to be applied with over top of like youth gangs or groups of like soccer hoodlums that get together and they commit mischief or like disturbance related and sort of what's the right word, disorder type crimes.
So are you talking like if we think of some of the school violence that's gone on lately, and it's this group versus that group, will we call that a gang? No,
not necessarily.
Just because a group of people stood together when something happened doesn't make them a gang.
Correct. And so it would be a misnomer to be classifying those guys as gangs. And that's not to say that they can't evolve into gangs. And those are precursors for gang behavior. But it certainly it facilitates a conversation to have a solid definition of what is a gang, what is organized crime, what are we doing here, what's the purpose here, what are our aims. We have to be able to measure it correctly. In order to measure it, we have to have a definition. So we here in Edmonton, we operate off of the essentially the same definitions. And when we look at the history and the evolution of gangs and organized crime here in Edmonton, and from what we've been able to see, it's uniquely shaped by demographics and geography and population density here in primarily Western Canada, not including the massively densely populated areas within like Vancouver proper. So here in Edmonton, at least, you look at demographically in the 70s and 80s, the city was like 250,000 people. We were very similar in, as far as I understand, in appearance and demographics to, say, Saskatoon. It was relatively homogenous population, stable sort of economic structure that people were, there wasn't a ton of boom and bust because Edmonton exists so prevalently in the oil and gas and the energy sector. There is that fluctuation in terms of how people are doing. But historically, we can see that organized crime consisted of like robberies and peddling in stolen goods. And we can even extend back to the Prohibition years where booze running and stuff like that was taking place. And we have existing crime structures from those early days in the settlements of the province 150 years ago. And the demographics that these gangs, organized crime groups that were primarily sort of composed of were either kind of homegrown white dudes, or we had indigenous centric crime groups that were either using the reserves as kind of a home base or would come from reserves. And there was this interaction between areas. And we're all geographically kind of located close enough so that crime crosses between between borders of municipalities, I guess we can say. And then we see a disturbance or an alteration in the demographics with an elevation and an increase in immigration to the Edmonton region. And so in the 70s and 80s, we had a huge influx of Southeast Asian communities, so India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We'll broadly term those groups Southeast Asian. Huge influx in East Asian immigration and refugees from typical countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, so on and so forth. And then a little bit later in the back end as Lebanese and Caribbean sort of influx in population. You get all these people that come in, and they bring with them different cultural norms and different sort of expectations for how they operate within a broader community. And so you get these changes in demographics, and it creates initial sort of destabilizations of social groups. And that's anything from the makeup of who your PTA, Parents Teacher Association, might be, to who your kids end up going to school with. It changes a bunch of things in the economics and education sector. It also changes the face of who's involved in crime and criminality. And so historically, and this has been really backed up in both objective research and subjective sort of case studies, is that we find we can unequivocally say that immigration and refugees don't necessarily cause organized crime or gang behavior or cause an increase in crime. What it does is it changes the face. Those from those immigrant groups or those ethnic groups, they alter the face and the demographic of who's involved in crime, we get a bunch of kids who don't feel like they fit in because they come from a culturally different place. So they're not Canadian enough. I use that in quotations because that's been quoted to researchers. They don't feel Canadian enough and they feel ostracized within their own peer group. And they can't turn to their parents or their family because oftentimes their family doesn't have the social skills or the language skills to help their kids navigate this new sort of social minefield.
Mm-hmm.
And so these kids stick together. They come together in groups that are ethnically homogenous, typically. They have shared values and shared appearance and shared sort of language sometimes, religion sometimes. Social activities are similar within the group. And
There's always something that kind of bonds them together.
If you look historically across humanity, we tend to lump together
Mm-hmm.
in either appearance or shared experience or shared interests,
Mm-hmm.
and we group like with like. You like the Oilers? I like the Oilers. Let's high five and wear a jersey together. Yeah. It doesn't matter where we come from. We have that shared experience when we band together in representation of what our interests are or what our goals are. And you see that constantly in terms of it's like an us versus them. Humans are very, very good at grouping together along whatever kind of lines. And so when you get these kids coming from these different kind of cultural experiences, some of the kids band together and they decide, you know what, we're going to take over the cardiothoracic surgery at the University of Alberta, and they get together, and that's that friend group that goes forward and does well academically and maybe economically. And then some of these kids get together and they decide, I'm going to be really good at organized crime. Mm-hmm. And they get these pervasive, long-lasting, well-bonded crime groups that are hard to infiltrate, they have loyalty towards each other, and they have this background of shared experience and family kind of affiliation, and it makes it hard for the existing power structure or the existing policing group to have an impact on the crime type that these guys get into. So in the 80s and 90s, there were principal crime groups that had existed as social groups together, kids together, and then they graduate towards more serious violence. And then that's where they satisfy those criteria of group of three or more with long-lasting, pervasive sort of relationships, and they participate as one of their primary activities in this serious crime. So when we look at the evolution of gangs, oftentimes groups of typically young men will get together between the ages of like 17 and 24, and they'll band together, and it can go younger as young as 12 sometimes. They'll band together for like protection and belonging, and they get together and they might do some juvenile delinquent stuff, but they're generally just forming their own social norms within a group, and they get together, they belong to something, or they're protected from external sort of predatory forces or what they perceive to be social dangers or physical dangers. Mm-hmm. And then invariably, we get these groups that will test the waters in the use of violence. And the use of violence is what delineates and defines street gangs and organized crime in terms of who the police need to pay attention to. So I can go off on a tangent. We were talking about this earlier. There's a debate about the role of police in our society. It's certainly more prevalent now than at any time in my history. And we look at what the police are for and what the role of police. If you look at the historical sort of anthropological record of what human beings are prone to do, it seems that we did very well in at least extending back to hunter-gatherer times in having social influence over the members of our group. So we belong to a small group. There's some sociological theories that are rooted in some observation in primatology and some sociological studies that talk about the monkey sphere,
Mm.
the primate's ability to maintain social relationships with a cohesive group. It depends on the type of primate and some of the environmental factors that exist in influencing this group. But by and large, researchers suggest that you can have about 120 really solid or 100 to 120 really solid connections before group cohesion starts to erode. You can have some social consequences for antisocial behavior
Mm-hmm.
amidst a group where everybody knows your name, everybody knows each other, and we can shame Ryan for taking Nathan's, you know, iPod or whatever it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the ability to have authority figures, respected authority figures within that tight knit community that can exert either power or influence, and we get group cohesion to a certain extent. I didn't live back then, so I can't say how entirely successful it was.
I'd almost say this sounds kind of like if you think of it, your dad being disappointed in you as opposed to just saying, listen to me because I'm in this position. So it's the positional authority versus you got what would you call it?
Well, there's
Lost
social
for the term
consequences.
here.
Yeah, there's social consequences
You just don't want to disappoint them.
to people that matter to you because we're highly social beings, and your social status within a group of your peers or the people that you respect matters, and it seems to dictate behavior to those who aren't suffering some sort of like disorder or mental illness or some sort of debilitating kind of inability to function in those social
But
circles.
nowadays we've completely moved away from that.
So we've drastically altered in the span of a couple hundred years. Well, it's been going on for about 1,000 years. We've drastically altered how human beings live and interact, and what we've constructed in our urban sort of orientation and in our industrialization is that it appears we have this vast anonymity within our communities. And what you present to the world, either selectively through social media or your friends at work or whatever, is this facade and this limited sort of view and window into who and what you are. And we all have to sort of interact with each other to get along, but there aren't pervasive, long-lasting sort of connections to people that can impact you socially. Once you leave your house, if you're lucky enough to have either a nuclear family or whatever your formative years are, once you leave that sort of family group, that family unit, there's a very real possibility that you could go the rest of your adult life without having to suffer any of those social consequences. So it appears that we in the Western world, at least, have come together and created a system to counteract that anonymity and the ability to be a antisocial or a bad actor within a broader community where we have no capacity to reach out and say, hey, you can't do those things.
So this is where the police would
And this is
come
where
in.
law and the police system have had to come in and replace those social consequences. So we collectively, as a Western society, have come together and said, well, we can universally sort of debate, but we can come forward with these prescriptive values. You'll see that they're remarkably similar to the Ten Commandments sometimes, and I'm not a religious person, but it's foundationally based in you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't hurt, you shouldn't take what's not yours, you shouldn't be an asshole. And if you are an asshole, who do we turn to? Because we can't turn to each other, because you might be able to get on a train or in a car or whatever and travel outside of the influence of this social circle and just do whatever you want, and there's no impact or no sort of consequences. So we've created the modern day policing structure and the state mechanism to facilitate that, to act as the consequence, to act as the surveyor and the keeper of the rules.
I think it's you can see that in a few different things that we've taken out of society, right? So things like death. You don't see death on day to day. You got a very specific person or set of people that go and remove a body from a situation or deal with it after the fact. But the day to day person, probably never seen a dead person. Whereas you go back, I don't know, 100 years and
The family
you
cared
see
for
all
their
kinds
dead.
of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And
There's a bunch of situations. So now talk about your own self-preservation, people protecting themselves. That's been completely removed from society. We're a civil society. Nobody needs to walk around with their gun slung and their ninja sword on. And
yeah, there's an exchange there. There is an exchange that people fundamentally, in order to live in a broader society like this, and this might be a little controversial, you give up some of your personal liberties and your personal sort of freedoms in order to be protected by the group. And the group could be a bunch of spear wielding hunters, or all the way up to we exchange our hard-earned wages based on the time we've spent to be able to be protected from the elements by paying some faceless company to give us gas so we can heat our homes and whatever else. So we trade our personal liberties and our jeopardies for a sense of convenience, modern convenience, and modern technology to make our lives better. It sequesters us outside of what some people will call the natural world. It takes us out of that existence where you're dealing with death or famine or it is pretty well established that there's a lot of hardship outside of these civil societies. So when we talk about the police structure and where the value is in policing, and I'm not a cop apologist. I'm not a lock them up and throw away the key kind of hard stance. Cops are right in all instances. But what I start to see is that the police need to be inserted into civil society at the critical juncture where what is happening exceeds the community's or exceeds the public's capacity to have an impact or to handle whatever is happening in front of them. So severe mental illness, severe illness, minor illness, your mom and dad take care of you. You can administer some semblance of first aid or minor sort of pharmaceuticals in the home or whatever environment. But when it gets serious enough, you have to turn to a professional. You take them to a doctor or hospital.
So I don't remember where I've heard this, but I heard it in probably another podcast I listened to, and I thought it was, it's had me thinking about it for a while, but I was thinking the police act as the closed fist of the public. Essentially, we're out there not to be your, your not hitman, but like your bodyguard, and we're not there to just at your beck and call to go deal with this person, but we are there doing the job that nobody else wants to do, and that's been removed from society.
When you're not obligated to protect yourself, when you're not obligated to kill for yourself, to go out and chop wood for yourself, when you're not obligated to do all those things, it's not within your normal day-to-day operational kind of capacity to figure out how to wire this car or how to wire my house or like any number of these things that have now become specialized. And there's a ton of benefit for specialization with it, like the occupational specialization that we see. We get enormous personal satisfaction for people that are interested in just what they're interested in. They can trade that labor or that effort, and they can exchange that for safety and security across their lives, and a whole bunch of different reasons for why that's a good thing. And what we have to understand, and what a lot of people don't agree with at present, or maybe it's not a lot of people, but there's certainly a vocal component of the anti-police sort of viewpoint, is that human beings can sometimes be violent and irrational or self-interested to the exclusion of all others. And when you look at trying to influence that behavior and trying to sort of have some sort of power to bring to bear against that sort of either self-interest or not just self-interest, but malice towards others. You have to be able to offload that and rely upon somebody to be the professional application of force and violence. Because human beings can and will be violent, you need an apparatus that some sort of ability to meet that violence. And man, do we have to put a ton of rules and expectations and measures around that application of violence, and that we've done that. We've
Well, I think
exhaustively.
people don't realize too that, as a normal everyday citizen who doesn't do policing, you are subject to usually the only things you're ever going to come across is maybe criminal code or, some provincial acts under in that realm. Like you get a ticket or something. Or the other side would be the civil side. Somebody sues you. But as a police officer, you have other levels of accountability just by doing the job that you're doing. So the Police Act. So I could do something that isn't criminal and maybe I don't get sued for it, but it just kind of look like, somebody in the service says, I just didn't really like what you did. Discreditable conduct. Give you the catch-all and just might make us look bad. Might not meet the threshold for criminal. Well, a normal citizen is not subject to that.
Yeah, and so I think that depending on individual agencies and individual kind of guiding national principles across the Western world, we have some variability in what's acceptable and what's not. We have varying degrees of oversight over these policing bodies, but universally, the expectations are that there's a professional application of the authorities that are granted to the police in absence of people being able to use violence and force and incarceration or sanctions themselves. And so when you look at the insertion, that critical juncture of where police need to come in, we start to look at the application of violence on behalf of so individuals who become violent are one thing. They use violence to get what they want. Generally speaking, if we get somebody who just decides they're going to dedicate themselves or finds themselves dedicated to a point in time where they're using violence to get what they want, oftentimes those individuals can be, that behavior can be neutralized either by the introduction of police, and there's criminal charges and there's a whole bunch of sanctions that can exist to be able to influence that person's behavior, or we find a way to have some sort of social impacts on that person to get them back into what I like to start talking about as this social contract. We all abide by this social contract. I agree to drive on the right-hand side of the road if you do, and I'm not going to stab you with a fork while we're eating dinner at some restaurant together because you looked at me weird or something like that. So we have an obligation, and there's these codified rules throughout society that comprise the social contract. And people who operate outside of that, as individuals, we have the ability to have some sort of impact, and those impacts hopefully change that behavior. Where gangs now get involved, it adds another layer of complexity and jeopardy to the overall community, because gangs will traditionally and typically act in each other's best interest or in the interest of the gang. And so if I incarcerate one member of the gang, there's nothing stopping from another member of the gang continuing criminality and violence in their stead on behalf of that individual or for the material benefit of the group. And so when we get these gangs that are graduating from that early protection group to we're going to use violence to get what we want, and then they progress and they become more sophisticated into like legitimate organized crime group. And then some of those legitimate organized crime groups, through sophistication or brutality or both, they graduate even higher and become actors on a broader stage, so they become multinational, multi-jurisdictional organized crime groups that can influence and destabilize entire industries and power structures like the judiciary or business or municipal governments or federal governments. So all up and down the spectrum, what we call the spectrum of gangs, we have the threat or the use of violence that kind of differentiates them from other crime groups. Because you can have, for example, you can have an organized crime group or a crime group that is consistently nonviolent in what they do. So I look at fraud rings or professional like shoplifting groups. They migrate across Canada. And they have sophisticated systems of defeating security measures throughout retail stores, and they're nonviolent, and they get away with hundreds and thousands of dollars in product, and then they use that to live their lives, or they ship it overseas, or wherever, whatever they do with the capital they generate from that. I would say, and this is my opinion, that society can still have some sort of effect against that group by those kinds of groups. But the introduction of violence is where we as a community should all go, okay, we need to hand this off to the professionals that are capable and able of dealing with that violence, with their own violence perhaps, or with training in de-escalation of violence and so on and so forth. So we talk about police need to handle gangs in concert with a bunch of other social structures that can help to either prevent or alter the behavior of a gang group. So getting back to the Edmonton context, you start to see in the 80s and 90s, you see these groups of young men that have come together within the existing demographic of whoever is involved in organized crime in Edmonton. And then you have a really, really interesting marriage between these gang groups and the use of technology to facilitate their criminal enterprise. And so what we saw was the advent of cell phones. So I'll go back a little bit. Drugs became really, really serious and started to really cause a lot of havoc. And in particular, as cocaine was introduced into North America way before the 80s, but it started to really, really pick up steam in urban centers in the 80s and 90s, and crack cocaine came in right after that. And typically what we saw in Edmonton was that there were a few instances of what we call fortified drug houses, and these are barricaded, guarded drug houses where somebody would be involved in distribution from that particular address. If you wanted this drug, you would go to that house, and police would have to try and defeat that by picking people off coming and going. But there was a lot of covert behavior surrounding the use of these drug houses. And if we look across North America on the eastern seaboard, you see a lot of neighborhood to neighborhood gang existence, and these gangs get together and they either control a commodity, so like prostitution or drugs or illegal cigarettes or firearms or stolen goods or whatever, this commodity based sort of economic driver. And in order to control their either neighborhood or their product, you would see like entire apartment blocks or neighborhoods taken over by a gang, and they guarded their turf really, really strongly. And that's where you get block to block sort of violence and the graffiti tagging and all the rest of that. That's conventionally what we see in media. And I guess in Edmonton, at least, and most of kind of Western Canada, is that we didn't have the population density to support that kind of focused and concentrated criminality in particular areas. And so that spread outness and that lack of population density made that model really difficult here. And when you pair that different demographic and that that population density and the introduction of cell phone technology, you get some innovating young people. And that's when the term dial-a-doping was essentially invented here. As far as I understand, historically, Edmonton-based drug dealers started employing the use of cell phones. And so I could be pushing my own brand of cocaine, and I would run a phone number 423 dope, let's call it. And everybody knows they can call that number. And I, as the principal drug dealer, would distribute my product to a very select few people. We would recruit young men, typically between the ages of like 16 and 20, with clean driving records and who looked somewhat proper. And we would give them a set amount of drugs, and they would get the phone for 8 to 12 hours, and they would be expected to sell these drugs at this price, come back to this designated person to supply you with more drugs once you're out.
Yeah, and that still continues today.
And 100%, that is the model for drug dealing here.
Kind of the lower level of, I guess, the hierarchy. That's what they're doing on the street.
Ultimately, that's how a vast majority of our street level drug dealing occurs. So somebody phones or texts that number, and they're able to have that it's pizza delivery for drugs. And what was happening with that group of organized crime groups, or that selection of organized crime groups? So there was the Asian organized crime that primarily stuck together. They would form alliances and relationships with other crime groups to for whatever reason. So some sort of positive benefit or a positive social interaction. These existed within power structures. So on the far end of these existing crime structures, you have low socioeconomic, indigenous-based street gangs that are still pervasive to this day. You have much more organized, sophisticated groups like our outlaw motorcycle gangs that follow like a hierarchy and a structure. These new emerging groups find room in the spaces in between, and they find opportunities to expand their enterprise and make their impact and make a whole bunch of money and power and respect here in town. So we see the groups that were existing and rising to power. They come from cultures where there's use of knives to commit violence. And so we had a lot of stabbings at the hands of these organized crime groups, and not a whole lot of availability of guns, and not a whole lot of familiarity in use of guns. And this goes outside of like the use of video games to familiar yourself with guns. I'm not as well read on that stuff, but and it's
I
debatable.
don't buy it.
It's completely debatable, but we see the manifestation of this violence with a lot of knives. There are some shooters and some guns that involve or that exist within these groups, and what we see is these groups mimicking what they believe is the best way to do these gangs is to belong to a group, have a shot caller or a leader. You have a unified group identity. So through symbology like tattoos or clothing or hand signals, or there's
just the gang names.
Names. You have undying loyalty to this mission and this cause, and we're fans of the Oilers. We wear the jerseys. We spend our money, or whatever it becomes. Any sort of group identity. So these gang groups adopt a unified group name, and they there was one group, they had the MR2s. They had to drive the same MR2 car. It's a crappy, I think it was a Toyota.
A little coupe.
Those sports cars. So what that does is that makes them instantly, it gives them notoriety and it gives them group identity, but it makes them also easier to prosecute against because cops can say that these guys are a group. Why? Because they told you they're part of this group through their use of symbology or identification with this group. And so Canada as a nation tried to enact some stronger legislation, put some sections into the criminal code to help police combat this growth in sophistication for gangs and organized crime groups. the result is that the gangs existed in this power structure for about a decade. And then there's historically in Edmonton, you see a change in who decides to stay in and what kind of group cohesion you have. So Asian organized crime was the major distributor of drugs and power and influence here in Edmonton, in the Edmonton region, facilitated by and supported by some other structures. But then you have group infighting, cross groups and within groups. And we see an evolution of the use of firearms with these gangsters. And we could sit here and fill up an entire day in terms of philosophy on why we think guns became more prevalent. Some people suggest that it's reflected in our media consumption, so movies and TVs and rap videos and a whole bunch of other stuff popularize and glorify the use of guns.
Well, now people think it's from COVID, or at least that's what the news tells people.
Well, yeah, we can talk about the COVID effects for sure, but
no, I don't really want to.
I think our gang problem existed long before COVID came along, and it hasn't really been influenced by disease and illness and pandemics.
But if we're looking at the history of the gangs here, so you're saying a lot of stuff kind of started around with there's Asian organized crime was one of the first major players in kind of like our modern era of gangs.
Yeah, correct.
The stuff that still kind of has an influence today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we see in these gang groups is that they are typically influenced by some of their own cultural kind of expectations and norms. And so a lot of these guys end up mimicking, either for parents' approval or social approval or fitting in with society, mimicking the nuclear family. They get jobs and mortgages and get a family and raise kids, and their kids go into school. And at some point, generationally, they're going to migrate out of that criminality and that gang, unless you teach your kids to be part of the gang and it becomes a multi-generational sort of organized crime family, which happens and has happened here.
So with the Asian organized crime, that would have been, we'd be talking like the FK, the Fog Killers.
So here in Edmonton in particular, and it's kind of reflected down in Calgary, here in Edmonton, it was the Crazy Dragons and the Crazy Dragon Killers. They're real original with their names. And those come as a result of, personal beefs or personal conflict between individuals that used to be criminally aligned, or
not COVID.
Definitely not. Definitely not. The reasons for those conflicts come from both their criminality and their commodities trafficking and stuff like that, all the way down to you stepped on my shoes at the club or whatever it became. And so I find it very interesting in terms of the spaces that those gang guys occupy when they're in between their criminality. So oftentimes in some depictions in media, you'll see like block parties or gangs on the eastern seaboard. They take over entire blocks, and that will be their entire world, their social structure, and their recreation, and all the rest of that stuff happens in that geographical area. Not so here in Edmonton, at least, and to a certain extent down in Calgary as well. Is that we get this behavior where they don't want to stay at home and they're living in regular neighborhoods, and it's not as cool to be just at your house when you're a gangster. You end up being able to go to peddle your influence and enjoy the fruits of your illegal ventures, and you go to these clubs, and we see them interact with the most of the public and our community in these social spaces, in bars, restaurants, nightclubs, lounges. And that's where they're able to enjoy their status as dangerous individuals or individuals with money and power and clout and bravado and the women and the celebrity lifestyle and a lot of that stuff is really, really attractive for those guys.
Well, I think we'll kind of get onto that when we talk about the intervention stuff and some of your professorial endeavors that you take on. But so where do we move? We were talking about having the Crazy Dragons, CDK, and then what is it? So what's the evolution to where we are now?
So then the evolution is that we move and we see here in Edmonton, at least, we see Caribbean-based kids with Caribbean history and ethnic kind of origin for their families, and they band together into two distinct groups: North Side and West End Jamaicans is what they call themselves. And there's some police name groups and some self-name groups. I'm not going to get too heavy into the groups, but we can say that there is an existing conflict between those groups and within those groups, and we start to see the emergence of the use of guns in the Caribbean and the black kids.
This is like the Hall Party shootings,
Caribbean heritage. And this is where we've moved in the late 90s and early 2000s away from we have a number of clubs in the city that are welcoming and attractive and play great music and pretty women and a whole bunch of other stuff, and they start having a bunch of shootings at these clubs because you get this interaction of adversarial groups, and they're not in like geographically controlled block to block areas where you have all of your shooters that live real close to you, and they have all their shooters. And if we want to reach out and hurt you, we go to your block and we shoot up your block. That doesn't exist in Edmonton. And so these guys, the volatility here in Edmonton is that everybody wants to go to these clubs and be seen in these social spaces. And so they come up against each other, and they know where each other is, or they come in these chance kind of encounters and they shoot at each other, or they wait outside and they shoot them as they go out the front door.
So these groups, so we have development of the Caribbean based groups, and then the OMG stuff. So the outlaw motorcycle gangs, Hells Angels, and all their friends. They're still, because they've been around for a long, long time. Where do they fit in this whole scheme of things?
They exist at the upper end in terms of power and influence. We believe at this point that the existing outlaw motorcycle gangs hold a particular capacity for power and influence over trafficking of a number of different commodities. So whether it's drugs or particular drugs or human trafficking or whatever, we see interaction with a bunch of really, really high-ranking Hells Angels members across a number of different kind of ethnically oriented organized crime groups. So Asian organized crime guys and hanging out with Caribbean guys, all with these bikers at kind of the epicenter, or consistently across multiple groups. So they don't have it doesn't appear that they had any type of preferential loyalty towards one group or another.
Wherever money can be made.
It honestly seems like
that's what it comes down to.
And then the indigenous based street gangs end up sort of existing in these lower strata, geographically kind of locked, almost like landlocked. They don't have upward mobility. They're not driving around in Bentleys with hidden compartments. They're relegated to driving around on BMX bikes, and their hidden compartment is their backpack or the gun they have slung over their shoulder with a shoestring attached to it.
So we have the development of Caribbean-based gangs, and then where do we go from there? So who's next?
The evolution of the power structure within Edmonton is that in the early 2000s, right around 2004, 5, and 6, we had the introduction of another crime group that has strong ethnic ties, and this is the Central East African kids, first generation and second generation Canadians, and they're Somali, Eritrean, Ethiopian, and they end up becoming Edmonton based. And from what we can understand is there's a strong contingent of these kids that band together, and it's a minority segment of that broader community in that population. It's a segment nonetheless, and they identify with each other based on their ethnicity. So they group themselves together. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for why they apparently feel segregated or ostracized from the broader community. And there's an entire day's worth of conversational topics. But we can see the behavior that is manifested from that group is that we have them involved in intergroup conflict, and then an external group of Central East African-based kids that are coming from Ontario and Quebec, and they try to essentially muscle in and take over what's happening here in Edmonton, and it results in very public shootings, a huge spike in the use of firearms within that community, and that has an impact across the rest of the gang landscape, because if one group is prepared to commit violence, it's just the same as how young burgeoning and emerging crime groups coming out of high school, that's how they differentiate themselves, who's willing to do the more crazy stuff and who's willing to commit the violence. Then we take the existing sort of social and power structure of the gang landscape here in Edmonton, and we introduce somebody more willing or more capable to commit violence and heinous, serious violence on their own behalf, and everybody else has to respond either in kind or get out of this lifestyle.
Or they look to use that group and say, okay, you are willing to use this extreme level of violence. If I can wield that power, so one group is going to use as a proxy power over another.
Yeah, absolutely,
say,
as a proxy.
Oh, let them go do the violence. We'll use them as the shooters. I don't have to pull the trigger, and the police don't look at me.
100%, and that has been the evolution of major players across the gang landscape here in Edmonton and across kind of North America. We get people to use others as a proxy for their own aims. And so the introduction of the violence and the firearms availability, and we can talk about how they got their guns, whether there was an existence of guns here in Western Canada, and whether they could be purchased or brought across border or stolen from break and enters and converted into handguns.
Yeah, a lot of it very much depends on the sophistication of the group and how much money.
But without a doubt. So one of the maxims I like to kind of express to a lot of people in terms of like the trade-off between security and liberty. We could turn this whole entire city into a maximum security prison, and we would still have contraband and assaults and murders and a whole bunch of things. I jokingly say, and I use it kind of with some levity, the problem is people. People are corruptible. So if you can't bring it across a border in this regard, then we'll try and compromise some sort of security measure on this side.
Well, I think with what you're saying there, though, is a lot of the narrative out there. So when you look at any of the media, you look at what any of the politicians say, everything is always, well, one is too many. And we should have 0 murders and we should have 0 collisions. And it's not realistic. And people being people, living all close together and on top of one another, you have to have an acceptable level of risk in there and built in. And I think people don't have these honest conversations saying, yeah, people are going to die. It's not saying it's allowed or that we permit it, but it's saying just let's be real about it and talk about real solutions. If we're just going to shoot for utopia.
Without making light of it, and without being able to quote hard stats, funny enough, I was reading a report not too long ago about the evolution of vehicle safety measures. So that with the improvement in technology and braking distance being reduced and responsivity and a whole bunch of different safety features, what seems to happen, what researchers find, is that it appears that human beings and people will drive in a more egregious manner the safer their cars get. They're willing to subject themselves to a base level of risk, and if they
feel safer now
to
go faster or do something more daring.
So they'll exist right. They'll push limits right to the breaking point, I guess, is for better lack of a better term. It appears that inherently human beings there's an acceptable level of loss or risk or injury. And I without being complicit, you can try and understand the broader kind of impacts of the existence and the realities of living with human beings. Because, like I said before, human beings can sometimes be violent and messy and self-interested, and that's the reality of what we have right in front of us.
So we're talking in the mid 2000s to kind of go back to this here. Mid 2000s, we're talking about Central East African groups, and some of the violence that we were seeing, where there was lots of shootings. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, and not to leave out any groups. There's plenty of white guys, for lack of a better term. We don't necessarily see ethnically tied groups of Caucasians sticking together. Like the Association of Descendants of Irish Immigrants don't make themselves a crime group, generally speaking. And we get these Caucasian kids and white kids that exist across a lot of these crime groups. So I'm not trying to in any way paint the picture that only ethnic minorities or visible minorities are participating in this crime.
Well, yeah, and further to that, I mean, we were saying there's indigenous-based street gangs. Traditionally, they were that, and then as they've moved into the city, there's been, like, we see black guys in those groups, we see white guys in those groups, and we'll get to the point, the current status of people in this city, the groups, and it's a complete mishmash of everybody. You see, there's brown guys in the Hells Angels. There's
out on the
half
coast.
These named groups, or what used to be named groups. They're a mix of everything.
So it's really interesting because you get this cultural influence when you have a ethnically homogenous group or a reasonably homogenous group. They're influenced by a crime group. I'm speaking about. They're reasonably influenced by the culture that exists surrounding them and their family and their peer group and where they come from. And that could be transplanted culture here in the Canadian context. But in some groups, we see a fractured sort of sense of loyalty to family or whatever. So it's not as strong, oh, you insulted my family name or whatever else, but there's reputational violence and reputational sort of wrongs that have been committed. You disrespected me in front of these girls or these whatever. And so we get some groups that are motivated by this reputational sort of sense of regard, and some other groups
like an honor violence.
And there are some groups that are really, really, really honor based, really strongly honor based, and so the violence becomes almost like vengeance at all costs. And we saw that in our Southeast Asian community. That's why Millwoods, that's the southeast corner of Edmonton, for a long time had a really, really bad reputation, was because of a heavy concentration of Southeast Asian people settled there, and the kids from their group that ended up getting into gang violence were tremendously motivated to commit violence on behalf of the group due to like reputation. And so we see fire bombings that go back and forth. The kids were calling themselves Southside Boys and Browntown and a whole bunch of other kind of self-named groups. And so we see this rise and fall of powerful groups willing to commit violence, or just bringing so much sophistication to their criminal operation that they hold sway and influence. And then the introduction of a new group willing to do crime or forced to do crime. We can get into the motivators, but these Central East African kids that get together. And then right around the 2010s, we see the formation and the alteration of our crime groups. A lot of our Asian organized crime guys have, like I said, aged out of this lifestyle. Lebanese kind of family groups, familial kind of aligned groups, are receding from that public use of violence. There's still segments of the population that are prone to violence or using violence, but we see them kind of out of the limelight, and we see an emergence of group of guys that are either African or Caribbean-based heritage. They've come together and form a broader super group, about 50 strong, and they're primarily interested in prostitution and drug dealing, and they commit drug dealing at the kilo level, so kilogram level, across multiple provinces, and it's quite an enterprise. And what the difference is between these groups is that they appear to, while they source importation of drugs through traditional lines, what ends up happening with this group was that they started to rip off other drug dealers internally within the group and then externally as well. They would watch, it's almost like Dexter for drug dealers. They would watch and hear and listen and do their own research and figure out who had a supply of drugs in town. And they would either commit home invasions with firearms, or they would commit kidnappings, targeted kidnappings to people that had access.
When I talked with Kim Bolin, she was on the last episode, and she was kind of talking about a similar thing, how they're becoming more sophisticated. We talked about her article that she wrote, The Anatomy of a Gangland Hit.
Yes.
And it lays out, well, they get they do this, and then they do this. They're doing surveillance.
Correct.
They're following each other. They've got informants into each other.
Correct.
So, yeah, they are becoming much more sophisticated.
Yeah, that's what we see with the advent of, I think it's for a variety of reasons. There's a number of factors as to why. At the reality of policing here, and I don't think I'd necessarily change it because I understand the genesis of needing disclosure. For example, in our court system, you deserve, as a defendant, you deserve disclosure of all the evidence the state is bringing against you. And the result of that is that the court can be seen to be completely fair and you can answer your accusers. But a side effect of that is that the people who are accused of being criminals, and whether they get found guilty or not, some of those that are found guilty or not guilty, some of those are actually criminals. Mm-hmm. And they whether we manage to prove their guilt or not. And I'm trying to be delicate with this because some people will say, "Oh, you're talking about them as if they're guilty." The reality is, let's be realistic. The reality is that police failed to make the case and bring it before a judge or a jury, and we failed to make the case that this person is guilty. But they still did it, and they still are ongoing in this crime and criminality. They learn from disclosure, and they are able to read line by line by line by line how police managed to defeat their efforts to go undetected. Mm-hmm. And so there's an element of that leads to greater sophistication on these groups. And if they can, they do. And if they don't have the wherewithal or the interest, then they, I don't know, maybe get a job and find another line of work. Yeah. But there will be some that exist within that system that learn from their own mistakes and from our mistakes and our successes.
So in the last decade, where have we kind of come to?
Well, it appears that this group of dudes in the 2010s that were picking each other off and it was cannibalistic to a certain extent, and it was highly predatory in other events. They started to adopt kidnapping and torture on a scale we hadn't seen before. There were instances and cases of genital mutilation that got brought forward to the police where they would pick off other drug dealers and other gangsters and do heinous, horrible things to them. And this isn't on a grand scale. Like I want to stress that I understand and know that we're not living in South Chicago with 500 murders last year. We're not living in, I don't know, Beirut. No offense to the people from Beirut.
I'd be surprised if someone from Beirut's listening to this, but maybe Chicago. maybe Chicago. One day.
And so when we start to look at the level of violence here, the broader community has, just like we absorb risk, an acceptable level of loss in how fast we drive our vehicles and the roadways that we have and traffic safety rules. There's an acceptable level of risk. We could make everybody really, really, really safe in traffic fatalities and set a speed limit of 20 kilometers an hour. Mm-hmm. I think I would venture to say we'd have zero road deaths
So
ish.
what happens with this group? So they're gone now, and
So this,
we're on to new ones?
yeah, this group, they ended up, we've got a bunch of guilty pleas out of these guys. They mistakenly, or it appears that they tortured a guy for a drug debt, and they made a mistake, and they ended up killing him. They the case isn't before the court, so I can't give too many details. But we've got a number of guilty pleas because these guys got into essentially a police chase, and the body was discovered, and a whole bunch of investigation yielded identifying these individuals, and a really, really solid core group of those guys ended up being incarcerated for 10 years or more. And so we see this new evolution. So between 2012 and 2018, we were able to start to measure serious instances of violence in these social spaces. And so we're able to see that because these young men happen to be involved in organized crime and violence, and there's an emergence of prevalence of firearms right around that time, and an elevation in prevalence of firearms, we see that the majority of both our victims and our shooters end up being able to draw roots back to these ethnically homogenous groups. So either these Somalian kids, and right now the Somali community has come forward and said that there are a number of unsolved murders because their young men happen to be involved in firearms violence and gangsterism at this time. And so we see this dominant group involved in firearms violence against each other. So at one point, I think we had, to the best of our ability, understood and tried to understand the ethnic kind of background of or identify the common denominators of who was getting shot and who was shooting. And we found that young Black men were either the victims or identified as shooters or suspects in these instances of public violence, to like 70 to 80% of all of our cases. And that's not because there's an inherent, we're not claiming there's an inherent sort of proclivity for violence on behalf of this group across all time and all demographics and all circumstances. In the Edmonton context, that was happening. And there was a number of different sort of social repercussions for that existence of that violence.
Yeah, these are the stats. Like, this is what, we know who pulled the trigger and we know who the victim was.
Correct. And we can say with certainty that the rise in proportion. So serious violence. Let's start talking about what's serious violence. It's shootings, shots fired. So somebody got aimed at, or there's property damage, stabbings, homicides, gang beatings, like these kinds of serious acts of violence. We can objectively say that a growing proportion of those instances involved firearms instead of edged weapons. Like that's reflected by the statistics. Now, the only caveat there is that these are the crimes we know about, the ones that get either reported to police or that we end up stumbling across, or we find forensic evidence of, or good, decent, credible witness evidence after the fact. There might theoretically, hypothetically, there might be just this mountain of investigated and unknown violence.
We get tons of those kind of calls. There's people calling all the time, say shots fired, or we heard a bang, and I was in the army, or I was doing this for a living, and that was a gunshot, and we'll drive around and not find a single thing.
And we don't find it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It could have been a firework. It could have been a backfire of a car. It could have been an attempted murder. We'll never know unless somebody admits to it.
Let's talk about. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So then we get this group that either moves along because of a bunch of different factors, incarcerated, or they end up being injured or dead, or evolving out of this lifestyle. And now we start to see, in the last 5 years, we start to see a change in the demographic and those that are involved in the violence. And what we can say that there appears to be a reflection in the ethnicity and the demographic, and it's reflected in the Lower Mainland conflict, and it's manifesting here in Edmonton and to a certain extent Calgary, where we have young men from the Southeast Asian community that seem to be getting shot and shooting at a more prolific rate than any of their other sort of counterparts across the gang spectrum. So kids, for whatever reason, are entering into this lifestyle, and there's motivation for violence within these groups, and a resurgence right around that kind of early 2010s to mid 2010s, with a peak at 2015, where young Somali kids again enter into this rash of gun violence. Young African kids or kids with African heritage are at the forefront of this use of public violence and firearms violence, and they seem to ebb and flow every few years, depending on some of the economics that are happening around here.
Yeah, and we see this pretty much daily. We deal with groups that are tied to Lower Mainland, tied to Calgary. Everybody's mobile now. Borders don't mean anything, and that's like including the Canada-U.S. border. Things get sent over that all the time. I think it's interesting when we talk about the type of violence that they bring here. So you can just go look at old news articles from like Kim Boland. She's a good author on this. But there's a lot of stuff out of Vancouver, Surrey, and the whole area down there. You'll see the techniques used by these groups transfer up here, burning vehicles after a shooting might happen. And the other day I was looking at some information and just starting to realize how some of these people are linked that we haven't heard of in some time. And we can see the connections and these, I think it just went undetected, but the emergence of these groups has been going on for years already in the Edmonton area. Like this whole violence issue, it's been developing for years.
Yeah, and I think that brings us really to the point of, well, why do we focus on the ethnic origin of these individuals and their families and where they come from? What's the point? The point is that what we found, and we'll start talking about intervention strategies going forward, and how do we impact this, and how do we keep people safe, and how do we help these individuals avoid the same fate being involved in gangs, because gang members and people that associate with like crime syndicates and organized crime invariably will always be subjected to greater degree and greater amounts and frequency and severity of violence in comparison to the general population. They will almost universally feel less safe than members of the general population, and the populace doesn't have to worry about somebody coming and macheteing them or machine gunning them for something they did last week. But our gang figures do worry about that all the time. So they're victimized themselves as they victimize other people. They're victims themselves, and so it's a horrendous way to live. That's what we can say unequivocally. Short term, it seems to be awesome, and there seems to be a lot of benefit. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. But in the long run, those people suffer fear and intimidation and violence at rates that far exceed other people. So when we look at intervention strategies, we find that the police can't do it themselves. So the function of police is not solely to incarcerate people or to lead to incarceration. And that was part of what I was talking about in terms of police's need to intervene when something exceeds the community's capacity to deal with. We talk about violence. We talk about criminal investigation. Police have authorities and powers that the general population doesn't. If your credit card gets skimmed, you can't go and knock on the door of the bank and get them to produce records. And that's the police's job as a professional organization, and professionals within that organization that are granted extra powers and authorizations and training to be able to solve crime that the general population won't be able to. And so when we look at efficacy of incarceration alone in dealing with crime and violence, historically we see up to like criminal sanctions up to and including the death penalty don't necessarily act as predictable, reliable, consistent deterrence to criminal behavior. And when we look at
Well,
homicide rates,
I guess the death penalty would deter the dead person from doing it, but maybe not the other ones out there.
well, yeah, certainly. We look at other countries that have a death penalty, and we still get people willing to commit murder for whatever reason, willing to commit drug dealing and all the rest. It just depends on the motivation, I guess. So it's the incarceration. Crime and punishment is supposed to be rehabilitative. Incarceration is supposed to be prohibitive or almost like a deterrent. And depending on where you fall politically or philosophically, you can speak to, yeah, that it is a deterrent. I didn't do these things. Or you can take people's personal experiences as they go through life. I didn't do those things because I didn't want to go to jail.
Well, my experience, and from the people we've dealt with, I worked downtown division for a long time. You always get a flood of people at the start of winter who come in and, hey, I have warrants.
Hey, by the way, I want to
throw their arms open and take me. And they want to go spend the winter in remand because it's, you get 3 square meals a day.
It's called 3 hots and a cot. That's right.
Yeah. Got TV and got some walls and
and so what are we doing as far as a deterrent there? Is jail too easy for them? From what I've heard, the remand ain't a great place to be, and there's still assaults that happen within that. And so people subjecting themselves, again, I think we could talk philosophically about if that's the best option those folks have. There's a lot of people with a lot of compassionate hearts that would say, dear God, can't we do better for those folks? That they're willing to subject to themselves to jail and imprisonment as a better alternative to living on the street or whatever it is. But besides the point, is the mechanism of what we as a society have determined as a fitting element and an appropriate element in part of the overall sort of like structure of, here's your consequence for antisocial behavior. It might be jail. It might be criminal sanctions. It might be a monetary fine. It might be some of that restriction of liberty until you either learn your lesson or to protect people, because you just can't be trusted to not victimize others. So you got to go in the bucket for a while. And while you're incarcerated, we're all the safer for it. Personally, I don't think it's going to benefit us as a society to lock them up and throw away the key in all instances. There are some people that I believe should be incarcerated for a very, very long time because they just won't rehabilitate. There's certainly room in the conversation to talk about that being part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. And when we look at interventions within communities, we have to appeal to where people come from, their peer group or their people that influence them, people that can have some sort of social impact on their lives. We have to also partner with those individuals for that gang prevention, that crime prevention. And so there's different intervention strategies across different ethnically aligned kind of sub-communities.
Yeah. So some things will speak more to certain people based on how they're raised, where they come from, what type of ethics and values they hold.
Without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. And so when we start to look at crafting engagement strategies, it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all, just be this community and do these things and make your kids play soccer or play the harp or carry grandma's groceries or whatever it is that we come up with. And try to shoehorn it onto a community that it doesn't have the same, it doesn't ring true to them, or it doesn't have the same impacts in that community. We're less likely to see any sort of appreciable impact on crime avoidance or group cohesion or adoption of any sort of broader social contract. And so when we start to see a trend in so if we all of a sudden Martians became a part of our society and emigrated to Edmonton, and we were to say that, hey man, Martians have been getting completely and totally wrapped up in a bunch of shootings lately. They're really got into the coke game, and Martians they're cornering the prostitution market or whatever it becomes. We have to be able to somehow approach the Martian community and say, how can we act in a meaningful and a culturally safe way, to
That'll have an impact on the
have
people doing
some
this.
sort of buy-in to the
Yes.
people that are suffering from this.
Well, and also, I would say, hopefully gets rid of the narrative of, oh, well, you're just picking on us because of whatever it might be. And it's like, well, no, this is what I see, what I hear, and this is why I'm dealing with you. But I mean, there's always other political narratives and reasons for why people spin those narratives, but they do a disservice to their own community, and they do a disservice to the people that need help, like the actual victims, and then trying to reform some of these people that are committing the violence.
Yeah, and it goes across all ethnicities. It really honestly does. And so what we see is successful intervention strategies, at least here in North America. What Edmonton Police Service is trying to adopt is a term and a strategy termed in academia as what's called focused deterrence. And focused deterrence took root and was formalized because the elements of the strategy have been in use in modern policing for decades and decades and decades. But in Boston, it's called the Boston Miracle or the Boston Gang Strategy, where they took their certain percentage of individuals who were identified as being heavily involved in gun crime and homicides in the Boston inner city. And they, as the state came forward together with the police leading the way on the intelligence side, and they came forward to these individuals themselves and their families and their legal representation and said, you are subjecting yourself to risk and the rest of the community to elevated violence, and it's unacceptable. We need to find out from you what the barriers are for you as an individual to abide by the social contract. Is it antisocial behavior disorder? Is it literacy? Is it drug addiction? Is it mental illness? Why aren't you participating?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you part of get on the team here, man? And the consequence is relentless pressure from the state apparatus towards you and your friends. If you still exhibit this antisocial behavior, everybody that you know is going to get a cop on their doorstep, and there's going to be a whole lot less discretion used on behalf of the police officers to exhibit both like a direct kind of consequence to those who are committing those acts of violence and that antisocial behavior, or even to their social support system. Like it has an impact on when your cousin's getting a mud flaps ticket. Your cousin says, hey, man, the cops are here looking for you last week. And while they were looking for you, they gave me mud flap tickets, man. So you either got to change what you're doing or like you got to stop coming around here.
Yeah.
But we have to be really, really, really careful in that. It's almost like, and I've never served in the armed forces, so I can't claim to know from personal experience, but from what I can read, it's almost like counterinsurgency work, where if we just go in with bombs and we just glass an entire area and are way too heavy-handed, what we get is we alienate the entire community that we're trying to help, and we make people into terrorists. Fighting terror, having a war on terror is like having a war on jealousy. Like it's not a conventional sort of thing. You have to change attitudes from within over a long period of time. So this focused deterrence piece in a partnership with the enforcement side, it is a very, very strong appeal to the community engagement side, where it's not just the police in an adversarial relationship against this individual and their entire community. The police and the state structure go to the community first and say, we want you to be prosperous. We want you to be protected and safe. We want to be, some terms are thrown in there, like culturally safe. We want to be justified in our actions. We want to be fair and accurate in our representation of who's involved in this crime and disorder. And we appeal to the community to be part of the solution. And so whether it's well, it can be a myriad different ways for different communities. And so consistently what we see in Boston in particular, they saw, I think it was a 50% drop the following year in homicide rates in those identified as being involved in this gun crime. And so that has been replicated across kind of the United States. It's been used in to varying different levels of success in Indianapolis and Oakland and a bunch of other places. And it varies in terms of how they're measuring ahead of time. So how does the individual police agency measure gun crime and community harm? And so the measures going in pre and post intervention have to be consistent across the board, and they're not going to be same between municipalities, because police agencies, unless you have absolute control over how they collect their stats, there's going to be variability there.
Yeah, and I would say with like a real eye for, I don't know, just making sure we're measuring things for the right reasons and not just because we want to obtain a desired outcome.
Yeah, the political sort of consequences and social consequences for agencies, unfortunately, has an impact on objective standards. And police agencies themselves, they have an obligation to be transparent in decision-making sort of structures and processes. We have to be objective and transparent in allocating resources towards the worst community harm, and when it's politically disadvantageous to say those things, it becomes there's a jeopardy there that can influence objective standards. And so it's unfortunate, but it's the reality of what we have to live in.
So real quick, because I don't want to keep you too long, but I just did want to ask about how the teaching job is. So
I had occasion this past semester to co-teach a class at MacEwan University, and I've considered teaching. I was originally going to be a teacher when I was thinking about and I'm considering going back to school. So it was a really great experience to be able to go and teach on selected issues in the corrections faculty within MacEwan. We teach all of the stuff that I said here today to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how much time we have in class. We teach about some of the history and some of the origins of crime and gangsterism, and it extends back to pirates in the 1600s, and the students are really great. This has all been kind of influenced within the police service. I had an opportunity to teach bias awareness and communication strategies to recruit classes, and there's elements of this that have worked their way into being able to teach and present both internally and externally to like conferences and stuff like that. And we teach about a concept called police legitimacy, where we have to be seen to be impartial and objective and a whole bunch of other things, and we get increased compliance the more the police stick to the rules that everybody agrees they should be sticking to. So a lot of that stuff kind of makes its way into being able to impart that to new generations of police officers. And then with this university experience, it's been pretty unique in terms of like these people are paying to be there, and they're not a captive audience and like I can have with a recruit class. But the teaching element at a university level, introducing some rigorous kind of academic standards to both where I source my information from and the expectations for them to be able to display that they've absorbed some of this in creating tests and stuff like that. The workload ain't my favorite because I got my own stuff to do, but it's worth it. It's worth it to be able to have that interaction and to kind of see the light bulbs turn on for a lot of people. So I think I'll continue to pursue it. And I've got a lot of peers across kind of Western Canada that are also doing the same sort of thing. And there's life beyond policing and teaching. I think being able to kind of speak to my own experience and apply it to lessons that we put out to the broader community. So
Cool.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this as far as a history lesson in terms of what we're doing as a police service, the appeal that we have to making things better, knowing and understanding we have a duty and obligation to do things the right way. Like I swore the oath. I swore the oath, and I volunteer and opt to come to work, and I get paid and compensated for my time. So it's on me. And I've been quoted before in another conference I did, and I said I was the face of institutionalized racism. And what I meant by that was, like, I'm a poster child. Like, if you were to amalgamate the kind of lived experiences or the stories of people that have expressed being subjected to some sort of institutional sort of influence on their lives, a bald 6'2" ex-football linebacker, captain of football, like a white guy, like I'm it. And so when I start to talk about what that does to relationships, and when I enter into a situation, regardless of what my intentions are, I carry that around. And I just had this conversation today with another police officer, or yesterday with another police officer. When I show up, it's like me carrying a bag of rocks. And I'm the one that has to put that bag of rocks down. I can't give that bag to the person receiving my policing experience or my policing services. It's on me to put that bag of rocks down and make sure it doesn't land on somebody else. So the ability to be mindful of what I represent and the symbol that I am, and still deliver impartial, objective, honorable, fair policing as that representative of the state. That's the evolution of policing. That's where we're headed. And so I look forward to some improvements in relations between our agency and the broader public, and us as an institution and as a profession in North America.
Cool. Well, that's definitely a fine line to walk.
Yeah, it is.
So I want to thank you for coming on again and kind of schooling us on the history of some of the things going on in Edmonton and our current situation. So, we'll look to have you on again.
My pleasure. Thanks, man.